Track C, managing the external environment.
Ten speakers are G. Alec Tatum III and Rick Alu. Rick and Alec are retired FBI agents. They have 52 years experience between them. They have a company down in Annapolis, which is near me, Intel Agents LLD. They're the types of people you might want to contact when you have a problem and don't want to go to the real enforcement agencies. Oh, that's a timed laugh. Alec and Rick.
Well, looking out over the relative youth of our audience out here, I would say that we have very few CEOs or CIOs amongst you. And for the purpose of this presentation, you are now CEOs and CIOs, because what we're going to talk about really talks to policy. And without further ado, if my, there we go. What are you going to do now, Lieutenant? That's sort of a military phrase where the colonel comes up to the lieutenant, there's a problem. The colonel's not going to solve the problem. The lieutenant's going to solve the problem. What are you going to do now, Lieutenant? This portion of the conference addresses the question, what do you do as the CEO and or CIO when the firewalls fail and you are faced with a situation which may be critical to the very existence of your company, destruction, theft, or loss of information? In our presentation, we want to place ourselves in your shoes as the CEO, CIO, as decision makers. So we're going to pose some questions which we think you would or should ask from your perspective of that position. But before we begin our presentation, we would like to introduce ourselves to give you a better idea of who we are and most especially who we are not. Again, we are retired FBI agents with an average of more than 25 years of experience in investigating complicated matters. Germane to this audience on the federal level are those crimes covered by the Interstate Transportation of Stolen Property statute. However, this statute, by experience, and others have proven to be inadequate, in fact useless, when it comes to addressing the theft of intellectual property or any of the other problems associated with the burgeoning informational world we now live in. We'll discuss one of the governmental efforts statutorily to address this issue later on in the presentation. We are not computer gurus. In short, we don't have in-depth technical knowledge of system designs or interfaces or networks or firewalls or web servers or intrusion detection systems and the like. We mention this because knowing what you don't know is as important as what you do know. Okay, if these guys are not technical experts, why are they talking to me in the first place? How can they expect to help me and my company? The answer to this question lies in the fact that despite your investment in firewalls and detection systems or some other state-of-the-art security system, which you've been hearing about over the last 2 days, one of you out there is going to experience a serious theft, loss, or disruption of information residing on your computer system or elsewhere to warrant the attention of the CEO, and more importantly, if it significantly involves the company's bottom line or the very existence of the company, You're going to be answering to your board of directors and the shareholders who want to know what happened, the significance and extent of the real or potential problem, and what you're going to do about it. Before moving on, a word about firewalls. A firewall is like a padlock whose effectiveness is measured by the time it takes to surreptitiously defeat the lock. For example, master lock, which you often see on bicycles, which has a two-sided tooth key, is what I call a 30-second lock. 25 seconds to bend a paper clip and 5 seconds to insert and open the lock. On the other hand, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a Medco lock with its unusual keying system would take an expert locksmith/burglar many hours to defeat, if they could defeat it at all. And we're talking surreptitiously and not taking a sledgehammer to it. For the purposes of this discussion, we're concerned here more about surreptitious entry than some brute force effort to defeat the lock, as I indicated. We're talking about intangible assets, theft, the loss of information and or intellectual property, and not generally about real property unless we're discussing where this information resides. Property that is in an individual's brain or on a computer disk or a server. Not money in a bank susceptible to the Willie Suttons of the 1930s. One further comment about firewalls and detection systems. They have been developed on the basis of historical information. That is, they are based on systems and methods of penetration in existence at the time of their development. Their effectiveness against new penetration schemes is problematic. The firewall is akin to a porch screen. The smaller the holes, the more protection you'll enjoy from the bugs, and the less likely that your system will be compromised. However, the screen can be so finely meshed that the potential exists for inhibiting the orderly flow of that information vital to your company's operations. This is not to denigrate firewalls or detection systems, but simply to help you understand there are limitations and the need for you to consider what actions you may need to take should they fail. How do you measure the impact of an intrusion, theft, or destruction of information or associated hardware? It runs from the mundane to the catastrophic. The only thing that concerns you is that the greater the consequence, the more likely you as the CEO or CIO will become personally involved. The nature of the intrusion disruption will drive your decision making. A disgruntled employee still on board, he didn't get his expected promotion, raise, or stock options, or recently was discharged, and he or she is angry that after the time and effort put into the company, he or she is so cavalierly dismissed, and now they want revenge. Or otherwise, you have a rival company has affected a technical penetration of your system, or more likely, suborned one or more of your employees or hired away key employees who walk out with the company's jewels, a design system in existence or on the drawing boards, your client list, pricing structure, or marketing strategy. Whatever you consider to be vital to the continued economic or competitive vitality of your company. On the other hand, you still must be concerned about the hacker, the prankster who views you and your system as a challenge to be triumphantly defeated, or the malicious, whose objective is to destroy for whatever reason, or some other entity, a foreign governmental element, or again a competitor who covets your property for whatever reason. Okay, what is the root cause of most computer crimes? And I think you've heard this in previous presentations. 80% of the problems you are likely to encounter will come from employees or individuals who have intimate knowledge of your company and its operations, not somebody coming in from the outside. It's too difficult. How will I become aware of this attack? Information regarding an intrusion will come from any number of sources. I'm just going to cite a few over here. Your intrusion detection system, or word of mouth from law enforcement, a friend, a competitor, a suspicious loyal employee, or your system crashes for no explicable technical reason. But unfortunately, many, if not most, discoveries of computer crimes happen by accident. I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to cite a couple that you're probably familiar with. The first one is Mr. Lorenzo, who was hired by General Motors several years ago as an efficiency expert, and then got hired away by Volkswagen. He walks out the door with his team with GM's marketing strategy for Europe, which ended up obviously in court, and I think everybody's familiar with what took place out there. I think GM finally won on that particular issue. Then another homegrown one was Walmart and their former employees who walked out with Walmart's state-of-the-art computerized inventory system. Now I'll give you one that you're not familiar with, but that I had personal experience with. We have a little small niche company out in Annapolis called Air Inc. Oh, I didn't know Air Inc. Well, Air Inc. is got a niche market with respect to supporting small airlines around the world in setting up their computerized reservation systems, controlling their flight personnel, their planes, etc. You know, their customers are like Air Congo or Fiji Air or what have you. In other words, airlines too small to be of interest to the two major companies and their computerized systems, which is United and American. And one of them has a system called Apollo. Anyway, they had an employee they didn't like, and or whatever it was. The guy had worked for them for several years, and they decided to fire him. I don't know how they handled the firing, but I don't think they handled it very well. They hired him on a Friday, and this guy toodles into the office on Sunday, and he's a program, a data processor, walks in, shuts down their main system, shuts down the backup system, and changes the access codes. Okay, bad for the company, bad for their clients. They walk in the door the following day and they're shut down and their entire clientele is shut down. I mean, the only thing they did right was at least they knew who entered the system last. And through powers of persuasion, I think they called in the local FBI office out there, they got the access code and got back online. Now I'll give you an accidental one. Here's this, there was a data process for a bank who opened an account under the name of ZZ Zwink, okay? Or some similar name into which he funneled manufactured bank service charges. In other words, if there was a bank service charge, he would add a few bucks here and there, et cetera, depending on the service charge that was added to the account. The only reason he was caught was as a result of a bank promotional campaign in which they decided to single out the first and last account clients who were listed alphabetically for favored treatment, okay? So, in other words, who the heck is Z Zwink? Well, it turns out to be their own employee, and the only money coming in was coming in from the bank service account. But if they hadn't run that promotion, they never would have found the guy. Okay, the bottom line is that people intrude, and people are generally the sources of information with respect to any incursion that has taken place. And at this particular point, I'm dried out, and I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Alec, who will speak for the remaining of the session.
Well, as the slide indicates, again, we're placing you in a CEO-CIO position. You're in charge, people. We're going to help you out. You've got a problem that's come to your attention. What should you do? The first thing that you ought to do is implement immediately your disaster recovery plan. Does everybody have a disaster recovery plan at your company? Does anybody have a disaster recovery plan? I don't see a whole lot of show of hands here. For those of you who don't know what a disaster recovery plan is, and just leave it.
We just got a little problem.
Yeah. A disaster recovery plan is nothing more than a plan, a previous plan that you have in place in the book, whether you keep it in your manual of operations, don't care where you keep it. You've got it on the books so that you can refer to it if a disaster happens. Because those first critical minutes, hours, or days following the discovery that you've got a problem, those are the most important minutes of your company's survival. The magnitude of the problem may not have reared its ugly head yet or shown its hulking brute force, but at least you've acted promptly to keep your company afloat, again, during those critical minutes, hours, days. Next slide. This DRP is nothing more than a well thought out step-by-step guideline for implementation in case you have a disaster. It's a last-ditch effort. You've got a problem, you go to your manual of operations, there's your disaster recovery plan. And it tells you what you should do, who should do it, how it should be done, and in what order. You've already thought it out. It's there in the book in case you need it. You may not ever need it, but it's there. The specifics of your disaster recovery plan for your company, only you can determine that. They're all different. It's whatever your company's needs dictate. The first component of any disaster recovery plan that you see out there recommends that you have an off-site location for backup and storage, archival of your company's operational data. And this off-site contains all your peripherals that you need, your backup data supply, your alternate power sources, any hardware, anything that you need in that backup location. But at least you've got a location separate and apart from your main computer operating center. The second component of any DRP seeks to answer the questions: what happened? How did it happen? What is the extent and nature of the problem? And basically, what do I do next? Step by step. What do I do next? And in answer to the first two questions, the FBI, as well as other knowledgeable computer security consultants, recommend that the second part of the DRP should include the following. One, you should be looking to immediately secure and preserve the evidence. How many times have you heard during the last 2 days? Preservation of evidence. That's the first step. Second step is to identify the time of the attack, and that comes from your audit logs that come with your operating system. It's your record of who's doing what on your network at what time. That's the paper trail. I've heard it many times during the last 2 days. If you don't have audit logs, you're screwed, blued, and tattooed. You have nowhere to start. Very vital. The third thing you ought to do is keeping of detailed notes of what occurred and how it manifested itself. And the fourth is saving any data on a tape system and taking the data off the network in the event of repeated attacks. And this is where it becomes tricky. They recommend notifying law enforcement. You have to understand that your particular company may have some PR concerns. You may have spin control, some damage control. You may not want to notify law enforcement. In fact, the statistic that we keep seeing out there is that 85% of all attacks, be it disruptions, penetration, hacker attacks, are handled internally. Law enforcement never hears about it. Next item is do a cost evaluation of the property, time, the purchase of a new equipment, new computer equipment maybe. And then, again, we're not up here hawking our wares, but they even recommend, and this is the FBI, they even recommend looking into the possible hiring of a private security consultant. Last item, be prepared to assist law enforcement in case you do call them in case you have to call them in case it necessitates the calling of law enforcement. And I think there's one other. And here's a key. If you've been hacked, if you've been penetrated, if your system's been disrupted and you have no idea where this attack came from, shut the system down and don't communicate with anybody by email, because hackers notoriously, if they've gotten into your system, they're out there just waiting to see whether they've been successful or not. So don't let them know about it. Now, when we get to the issue, what do you do next? What options do you have? Well, you've got several different options. First of which, you can stick your head in the sand and ignore the situation, hope it goes away, hope it's not as critical as it might seem at first. Second thing you can do, you can attempt to handle it internally using your existing company personnel and or resources. Third thing you can do, depending on the nature of the problem, you can call in law enforcement, whether it be local, state, or federal. And then your fourth option, you can seek outside professional help. So let's just take a look at these options and see the pros and the cons of them. First option, you stick your head in the sand. That's not really realistic, as we all know. You have to deal with the problem. If you're a public company, not only with your board of directors and ultimately your shareholders want to see what action that you took, but your employees will want to know. They'll keep a trained eye on the matter and see how you handled it. Now, before we go on to the next one, just to give you an example. We were contacted about 6 to 8 months ago by a very, very large telecommunications company in the Washington metropolitan area. And they had certain of their fiber optics cables cut. It appeared from the get-go that it looked like sabotage. They called us in, we took a preliminary survey of the situation, and yes, it did look like it was sabotage. But when it came to the whodunit, can you imagine the multitude of possibilities out there as to who done it? Is it internal? If it's internal, is it disgruntled employee on board, previously let go? Is it somebody, an outside competitor? Is it somebody just prank out there, vandalism? Could be anybody. And that's what we ultimately told this communications company, that yes, we could spend a lot of their money, but we would probably not get to the end result as to who did it, because there just weren't any facts out there. We told this to the chief counsel, and in the words of the chief counsel, I understand, I know where you're coming from, I appreciate the fact that you told me that you could spend a lot of my money without getting to the bottom of it, but you have to understand, I have to tell my shareholders that at least we looked into it. Bottom line, the shareholders want to know what you've done about this. If your company's private, at a minimum, your wife wants to know what you've done about this also. Option number 2, employing the company's own untrained, and I say untrained, you'll understand in a minute, untrained personnel to conduct the investigation. This detracts from the principal responsibilities or their activities that you hired them for. Are you going to take one of your favorite IT personnel and take him offline what he's doing and devote him to this particular project? I don't think so. You might. The problem is with internal employees. And you have to understand where we're coming from. We're not denigrating onboard employees. You guys possess the technical know-how, no question about it. The problem is that internal employees don't have the mental methodology of investigative activity up here. You're good at what you do. We're good at what we do. It's kind of like a lot of our clients are attorneys. Attorneys are great for going into court, but attorneys by and large are the worst fact finders and investigators that you could ever have. So if you, God forbid you ever have to seek legal counsel, but if you do and your attorney tells you that he's done his own investigation, I wouldn't trust that investigation too much. Again, that's by and large the general consensus out there. That's our feeling. Back to the internal employee. They don't possess this mental methodology. They're prone to actions, or they may be prone to actions, which might violate the rights of a suspect, whoever that may be internally. Some of these actions could potentially jeopardize the company itself and expose the company and or other employees to potential litigation. What you ought to be looking for later on is getting into the civil arena. That's where you're going to recover damages. You're not going to recover damages out of criminal prosecution. Whether we present the facts, law enforcement presents the facts, you present the facts to the prosecutorial authorities, you're not going to recoup any money damages out of that. The bad guy may go to jail, and you may take delight in that, but you're not going to get any damages back unless you get into the civil arena. And the problem that we see is using internal employees to do this investigation, particularly if they're not in tune with all the problems and chain of custody and preservation of evidence and interviewing witnesses and this and that and da-da-da-da-da. You may never get it into criminal prosecution, which I can guarantee you is probably going to severely limit you for civil prosecution. So that's another thing to consider. Okay, where are we? Option number 3. The first problem that you're going to run into in presenting this to law enforcement is who are you going to call? Well, the first people you're probably going to call is local law enforcement. But in our estimation, the likelihood is that the intrusion, the theft, or whatever it may be, the subsequent investigation will become public. And I'll tell you this for a fact. You put it into the hands of local law enforcement or state law enforcement like we're going to talk about in a minute, I can almost guarantee you it's going to turn up on the front page of your local newspaper. Why? Because the law enforcement elements out there, whether it's the local law enforcement or state law enforcement or the prosecutor down at the state's attorney's office, they love to hawk their wares at your expense because it's publicity for them. They get more money from the state when they handle these high-profile cases. So do you think they're going to consider your PR needs out there? Not in the least. So that's a problem. Some companies out there would prefer to have publicity, to tell the world out there, hey, you may have done it this time, but I guarantee you'll never do it again, to prevent future attacks. Another consideration in calling in particular law enforcement is that they're most often not equipped to handle it. Local law enforcement particularly. And I'm not up here, Dick and I are not up here to denigrate local law enforcement or state law enforcement or federal law enforcement. We're just telling you the facts. The fact particularly with local law enforcement is that they're not equipped resource-wise to handle these complicated investigations. Nor do they even have the interest to even entertain such a case. Just think, how many well-publicized murder cases have you read about in the last several years that have just totally fallen by the wayside because the local law enforcement departments that have handled them have not been trained properly, did not have the adequate resources forensic-wise to bring to the matter? That's exactly what's happening in Boulder, Colorado right now. And again, we're not up here to denigrate local law enforcement. We're just telling you a fact of life out there. Certain departments, particularly local law enforcement, when you get up to a matter of complication, like a penetration into a computer system, do not have the resources to address the issue. Money, manpower, expertise. Now, when we talk about state law enforcement, it's a little bit better, but not a whole heck of a lot. They may have a little bit more resources, but maybe they don't even have the expertise. So that leaves you with, guess who, people? The feds. And the feds have the deep pockets. You call the FBI loves these kind of cases. Except there's only one problem there. The feds now have, the FBI now has the Economic Espionage Act to work with, which in contrast to what Dick mentioned previously, the Interstate Transportation Stolen Property Act gives them a lot more power when it comes to violations, investigating violations of intellectual property crimes, both domestic and foreign. The problem with the feds is even they are limited resource-wise. In the FBI, I can tell you there are 5 locations, 5, throughout the country, 5 offices that have dedicated computer crime squads. Washington, New York, San Francisco, I believe LA, and Chicago. And if you're not living in those cities, forget it. They may or may not send somebody out to investigate your case. Most probably, they won't. So even the feds are limited resource-wise, even manpower-wise. The FBI, on an annual basis, fights for its money. And yes, they have money for computer crimes, but it's not a whole lot. We were told this by a colleague of ours no more than 4 weeks ago, what their budget was, and it wasn't a whole hell of a lot. So if you can get the feds to investigate it, that's great. There's one problem, though, with getting the feds to investigate it, and it's not with the FBI. It may be with the United States Attorney's Office, because what you don't know is there's a threshold of loss at the United States Attorney's Office. It's dictated by the U.S. Attorney General, and it is set out per jurisdiction. Now, each jurisdiction can alter this, which means your case, if you're in Chicago, may attract the attention of the FBI and may be prosecuted by the United States Attorney. But if you're in Macon, Georgia, they might not even care less about it. It's kind of like bank robberies. You rob a bank in Los Angeles, it's $50,000, call the sheriff. You rob a bank in Little Rock, Arkansas for $50,000, that's a major case. Just depends on where you are. Depends on where you are as far as this threshold of loss. It's a fact of life. We didn't invent it. We're just telling you facts. And oftentimes, even the courts are very lenient depending on where you are as far as computer crimes. Give you an example. A guy by the name of Robert Morris shut down 6,000 computers on the internet. You know what he got when he got caught? A $10,000 fine and 400 hours of community service. He never saw the inside of jail. Now, he shut down the internet for a long time, or certain parts of it. Let me give you an upside to calling in law enforcement, though. I don't want to be dismal up here and just down on local, state, and federal law enforcement. If you get law enforcement to investigate this for you, if they entertain it, you're in Fat City because you're on their dime, not yours. They've got the resources. If they utilize them, you don't have to. If they spend money, you don't have to. And it's great because if it ever goes to prosecution and the bad guy's caught, prosecuted, convicted, guess what you get to do with that criminal judgment? You get to take it from one court and turn right around and walk right in and sue him civilly. That's where you get your monetary damages. Civil court, not criminal court, be it local, state, or federal. So that's the upside. So we get to option number 4. And again, we are not up here to hawk our company. All right? We talk about option number 4, the outside professional help. Your last option may be to seek outside professional assistance. And speaking generically as corporate security and investigative specialists, we can tell you that we are fact finders. We told you, we're not techies. We're not the computer wizards. You guys are. We respect that. We're just telling you that we're fact finders. We know the criminal justice system. We're professional interviewers. And we're technically sophisticated enough, and I stress enough, to understand your company's business and know how it operates. The benefit of an outside professional is that they can assimilate information quickly, and they can draw upon their experience and their expertise to marshal the right resources to bring to the task. And that's critical. I'll give you an example. We have or had, before they went bankrupt, a major car dealership on the Eastern Shore. And this dealership had a comptroller for about a 15-year period who was milking them dry. And their auditors didn't even know about it, didn't have the faintest clue. Until the company president gets a call from the bank and says, we'd like for you to come down here and handle this line of credit to the tune of $400,000. And it was a total shock to him. That was his first instance of anything going awry in the company. He starts backtracking. His CPA, his auditors say, I don't know what you're talking about. Your books are clean as, you're squeaky clean. He calls us, and this is where the marshaling of resources comes into play. We called upon colleagues of ours who are forensic accountants, and in a matter of 6 hours, went through the company books for about a 10-year period, and finally told the car dealership president that his trusted employee, the comptroller, had embezzled $650,000 in the last 8 years. So that's kind of what we're talking about, marshaling resources. If we can't do it from our expertise, we know where to go to get the experts. While we're on the subject of marshaling resources, let me just give you an example. It may not be pertinent to what we're talking about on point, but the recent TWA crash off Long Island several years ago, both the NTSB and the FBI handled that as a joint investigation. Nobody knew who was going to take primary lead control over that. Was it sabotage? Was it an accident? They didn't know until into the investigation, and they flip-flopped hats back and forth during that investigation. It was an accident. No, it was sabotage. And when one kind of bore out over the other, they changed lead roles. In some of our most of our investigations, computer security-wise, we call upon computer forensic individuals to help us in an investigation. And we have a two-pronged attack to it. We bring our expertise, they bring their expertise, and we may flip-flop as to who's in control of that investigation from time to time, similar to this NTSB and the FBI. All right, let's just moving right along. We want to get you out here and get you to the gaming tables. Let's assume that you've chosen to seek outside professional help. Now, one of the questions is, right off the bat, what's this going to cost me? How much is this professional help going to cost me? And how, more importantly, how do I go about selecting this individual that you say that I need from the get-go? Well, assuming that you've had a major loss within your company, one that threatens the very existence of your company, you can't even weigh the cost of what this investigation is going to tally up. But I can guarantee you that most likely the cost of these services will pale when it's compared to the total potential loss that you're either incurring or that you might incur within this very critical period of time. I'll give you another example. We were recently called by a very, very big software concern. And their situation was they had what looked like an inside job, an inside theft out of their computer security room. No intrusion marks, no nothing that would indicate an outside, just an outside robbery. What was taken? $50,000 in equipment, a server, about a whole file stack of DAT diskettes. They were shut down for 5 days. But take that back. They weren't shut down. It took them 5 days to back up the data on these diskettes taken. The problem was, and they were very reluctant to tell us this, that server, $35,000 server, what was on it? It was a dedicated server to one of their clients and had $1 million value of clientele information on there. So it's not the equipment per se, it's what's on the equipment. Okay, option or question number 2. What should you be looking for in an outside security specialist? If you can identify one locally, great, so much the better. Go get them. If you got one that you know, that you trust, that's in your area, enlist their services. At least contact them. If you don't, then you're going to have to look for somebody who is intellectually sophisticated enough to understand your problem. Again, enough to understand your problem. And who's worked on complicated cases, and that's the key. Who has worked on complicated cases. Somebody who can review all the data that's necessary. Somebody who can conduct the necessary interviews of those people that have to be talked to. You don't get the right answers unless you ask the right questions. Somebody who can comprehend the technical aspects of the problem and situation and can ask these crucial questions. Somebody who has got the contacts, be it technical or geographical, to bring on board as necessary to address and attack your issue. Caveat here, don't be fooled, don't be misled by individuals out there possessing these lofty titles, that used to possess these lofty titles. Assistant director of this, director of that, whatever it may be. Because the ones we have encountered out there couldn't investigate their way out of a locked closet. They just don't know what to do. They were an assistant director of this agency or that, and they have this management control over a lot of people, but they're not investigators. And if you contact these people, more often than not, they're not going to do the work. They're going to have somebody like Dick and I do the work that charge a hell of a lot less. But guess what they're going to charge you? Twice what we charge you. And again, we're not up here to hawk our wares. We're just saying be very circumspect about who you contact out there. Now, one of the last slides, this is the key. You've heard it for the last 2 days. Timeliness is the key. Time delays at the outset of an investigation can and will be costly. You don't want to compound the loss by a delayed investigation. Don't wait till disaster strikes before you go about interviewing potential investigators to put their little card in your Rolodex card file or put their business card in your disaster recovery plan. Now's not the time to do it. Your objective in hiring a firm is to stem the loss and determine what happened, the significance and extent of the real or potential loss, and what you need to do based upon what facts are uncovered. God forbid that it ever happened to you. But the statistics are not good, people. Somebody in this 600 to 700 population that has attended this seminar, it's going to happen to one of your companies sometime down the road. We have an email address. We have a website. We'd welcome you to go visit it. If you'd like, we didn't put any of the slide preparations in the brochure. We didn't get time enough to do that. But if you'll send us an email or drop us a business card, let us have one. We'll be more than glad to get it out to you. And I know Jack's about ready to pull me off stage, but if there's any questions, we'll be more than glad to entertain them.
Yeah, if you do have any questions, please.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Isn't the stat 80% of insiders, isn't that a little outdated from 94 and 95? The internet grew about 15,000% approximately last year, and the security and the other technical people haven't grown at that same rate. It's been closer to about 60-40.
Well, the last ones that we have seen, and they were fairly recent, we still keep seeing 80% out there. Again, we don't make this up. We just have to go on what we have out there in published literature. But you may be entirely correct. I don't know.
In other words, somebody may have done a more recent study that you may be right. But the literature that we've seen on it has always, given us the 80% figure. Maybe it's, because of research that has been done. That's what people are.
We've always seen it in the 75 to 80% range.
Yeah. Now, the other part of it, is in our own experience, okay, most of the problems we see are internal. Very, very rarely that's an attack from the outside. Shoot.
In your experience, as far as getting the money in the criminal and the civil side, most of these people who are causing that havoc are penny, it's then not worth it.
That's very true.
That could be a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, in your instance, how many do you have like a percentage? Or
We don't have any figures on that.
No, it's going to be case by case, okay? Yeah, if you just got an individual that's not associated with a corporation, you're right. They're not going to, you're not going to be able to recoup the losses, okay? But very often, we find companies, they're so ticked off. What we generally do is we'll present a case for them into court, whether it's state court or federal court, to get the conviction. Generally, you can't get the attention of local law enforcement, aside from the problems with resources, etc., because of the fact they look on computer crime as a victimless crime. They don't see data as a value, okay, a dollar value. And they're more concerned with, local bank robber or somebody got murdered or kidnapped. The other problem you run into is that prosecutors very rarely prosecute computer-type crime, so it's strange to them. And then you got a bunch of judges sitting out there that, they just don't see it. So, but what happens is, like, in our experience, we'll take a case and we'll present it to a state court or federal court. The work's already done. The USA says, okay, I'll take it into court because he doesn't have to do anything. They'll get the conviction. Then the company says, okay, we got the conviction. We're going to take these guys for whatever they're worth. It's not going to cost us too much in attorney time because the case has already been made in federal court. And as Alec pointed out, they just waltz it into civil court. Shoot.
Well, isn't one of the major problems that we're seeing now is because there's not enough state statutes out there, because the only way to get the FBI involved is federal statute.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right.
If you don't have a federal crime, you're screwed. So you go to your local law enforcement and they say, hey, there's no crime in this state, or the theft becomes minimal.
Well, it's just like this example I gave you, this software company. Yeah, they had a $50,000 loss in equipment. And they called the locals in. The locals came out and dusted for prints and this and that and said, yes, we'll take your computer, your employee database, and we'll run it against people's access card, key cards, and this and that. And what they did, they came back about 3 weeks later and said, we don't know.
I mean, do you see a trend, in people lobbying for increased laws at the state level? Or is that one that nobody's touching because this is still somewhat in its infancy?
I think you're right on the money. You're absolutely right. And even on the federal level, the reason I brought up the interstate transportation, the stolen property statute, and then the economic crime statute, I'm going to give you a case that was not computer related. Anybody here ever hear of Amgen Corporation? Okay, huge corporation out in California. They developed a, mouse cell line, I forget, Ethiopian or something else like that. It was a blood enhancement development, bio development. Well, they had a race to the patent office with another company. They won the race, okay? Hey, this thing was worth $1 billion a year to this company. The rival company, one of the scientists was a buddy of another guy who was somewhat crooked. What they had developed was as valued as what Amgen had developed, but they lost the race to the patent office, but they still had the development information. They were trying to sell this stuff to foreigners through foreign investment to manufacture this stuff overseas. Guess what they wanted for the sale of this particular development, which would have been a mint to them. Screwed Amgen big time. $300,000. $300,000. But the problem is, okay, we caught him, right? Accidentally. We just kind of stumbled onto this case. We didn't have a statute to really nail this guy. Interstate transportation of stolen property is peanuts. I mean, $5,000 or $10,000 fine. So that generated, an effort to get new statutes on the books. And the one that they brought out was the economic espionage statute, which is you can't go steal intellectual property rights, whether it's bio or computer stuff, without getting hammered. The problem, as you pointed out, okay, we're getting these statutes on the federal level, but on the state level, I don't see anything. I just don't see anything.
It's still very new. I mean, 10, 15 years is still new. So.
Shoot.
One last quick question. As far as references in building some of these documents, there are a couple of subscription services like the Internet Law binders that you can get out of a California office, which they keep every month sending you updates to that. Do you know of any other good reference material that people can go after for that state level or whatever, other than actually having to read the code for the state law?
There's a guy in D.C. that does a monthly called Privacy. I think it's like $49 or $69 a year. Privacy. And I can't remember full details, but if you did a web search, you'd be able to find it really quickly.
Howard has one on intellectual property law, too.
Yeah. In terms of state laws, the one thing that I would add is you will see state laws when somebody like Governor Ventura gets hacked. I mean, that's how you get federal laws.
That's exactly right.
Senator so-and-so got hacked.
Exactly.
Who's the senator got hacked by the cell phones?
Oh.
I'll just use the example. When the Senate gets home, they get laws.
Yeah, it takes something major before they'll do anything. I mean, it's typical of how we do everything in this country. I mean, we wait till we're ready to go over the dam, and halfway down the dam we say, God, we did something wrong. We're going to have to correct that.
And the state, the locals in the state, they don't want it. The feds have got that.
Yeah.
They got their hands full of that. We don't even want it.
As the point was made earlier, there's not enough qualified resources in corporations in federal government, let alone state and local government.
You don't understand. I've been in computer security for a quarter century. I'm now an expert. Whoa! But for the first 20 years, who wanted me? It's the same in anything. When it becomes important, then people will find you. The better mousetrap.
Okay, I think we're done.
Okay, there will be a talk at 6 o'clock or whenever up in the A-track room. Feel free to talk to Alec or Dick to find out what you can do. This is a good method. Talk to you later. Bye.